Her words landed like a slap across the table. "You're a beggar," Celine said, smiling as if it were a joke, though her eyes held nothing soft. The laughter that followed was thin, uncertain. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on his wine glass. I smoothed the napkin across my knee, each fold deliberate, my pulse steady. Let them believe what they wanted. They had no idea the chair beneath her, the table before her, the chandelier above her head, all belonged to me. The café smelled of warm bread before the sun had even lifted its head over the rooftops. That was my wife's doing. She believed a place should wake up before its people did, so that when they arrived, it felt like a welcome rather than a transaction. We had only 12 tables back then, each dressed with mismatched vases she collected from flea markets. Some were chipped, some tilted slightly, but she said they had character, and character, in her mind, was worth more than perfection. She'd fill them with whatever the season offered, sprigs of lavender in summer, brittle wheat stalks in autumn. I can still hear the bell over the door, the small brass one that jingled whenever someone stepped inside. It was Daniel's job, at 6 years old, to run from the back room and greet the customer with a smile that would melt the iciest January morning. He had my wife's smile, wide, genuine, and just a little lopsided. We worked without rush in those years. Mornings were for preparation, slicing onions so fine they nearly dissolved in the pan, kneading dough until our hands were dusted white, arranging pastries in the glass case so they looked like a painter's still life. Afternoons belonged to the regulars, the retired postman who always ordered black coffee and a butter croissant, the young teacher grading papers in the corner with a cup of chamomile, the couple who came every Friday night for onion soup and wine, holding hands like it was still their first date. It wasn't wealth we chased, it was the warmth that comes when people choose your table over all the others. My wife used to say that love, real love, could be served on a plate if you seasoned it right. Daniel grew up in that atmosphere, in the soft clatter of plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low hum of conversations. After school, he'd do his homework in the booth by the kitchen door, the smell of roasting chicken keeping him company. Sometimes he'd wander in to lick the spoon after I'd finished stirring chocolate into the ganache. We didn't take vacations, we didn't need them. Our life was here, in the narrow kitchen with steam fogging the windows, in the laughter that rose when a dish came out just right. Even on the hardest days, when the oven failed or the supplier was late, we ended the night with a glass of wine and the quiet satisfaction of having made it through together. Sundays were different. We closed early, cleaned the counters until they shone, and sat at the corner table by the window to watch the light fade. My wife would rest her head on my shoulder, our hands linked under the table. Daniel would fall asleep with his head against the glass, the last rays of sun brushing his hair. I thought then, foolishly, perhaps, that nothing could shake that peace. Even when my wife fell ill, we kept the café running. She insisted on it. She said the place wasn't just ours, it belonged to the people who had laughed and cried within its walls. The regulars noticed her absence, of course. They brought flowers, cards, sometimes a dish of their own making, as if to return a small fraction of the comfort she had given them. When she passed, the café became my anchor. The smell of bread in the oven each morning was a promise, that I would keep what we built alive, that Daniel would inherit not just a business, but a piece of his mother's soul. I never doubted he would want it. I remember the day I caught him standing in the doorway, years later, after he'd started university. He was taller, sharper around the edges, but for a moment I saw the boy with the lopsided smile. "This place," he said, looking around at the polished wood and the faded photographs on the wall, "it's small." It was the first time I felt a stone drop into the still water of our life. Small? Yes, it was small, but it had been enough for us. I didn't argue, I just poured him a coffee and asked about his classes. Still, the word echoed in my mind long after he left. Those were the warm years, though, before ambition, before polished heels clicked across my kitchen tiles, before laughter became something brittle and cutting. In those years, the café's light was steady, the air always scented with rosemary and bread, and the world beyond our little street could wait. I didn't know then how quickly warmth could turn into shadow. But I suppose no one does until the sun finally dips, and the cold settles in for good. The first time Daniel brought Celine to the cafe, the winter light was slanting low through the windows, turning the steam from the soup pot into soft ribbons of gold. I remember wiping my hands on my apron before stepping out from the kitchen, curious to meet the woman who had coaxed my son into smiling again after his long, serious university years. She was striking. Not in the soft, familiar way my wife had been, but in a deliberate, polished way, every detail measured. Her coat was the kind that whispered money when the fabric moved. She extended her hand like a person used to making quick introductions at crowded parties, her smile precise, showing exactly as many teeth as she intended. "Your cafe is charming," she said, glancing around at the vases, the chalkboard menu, the wooden beams. Her eyes didn't rest on anything for long. I thanked her, and she added, "It's quaint, you must be proud." Quaint. Small. Words that slid off her tongue like polite compliments but settled in my chest with a weight I didn't yet know how to name. Daniel seemed lighter with her, though. They shared quick, private smiles over their soup, her manicured fingers brushing his hand across the table. I wanted to believe that was enough, that his happiness would knit her into our family, that she would come to see the cafe as more than a curiosity. In the months that followed, she came with him a few more times, always dressed as if she were stepping out of a catalogue. She'd ask polite questions about the menu but rarely finished her plate. "I don't usually eat much bread," she explained once, as though I'd asked her to justify it. Still, she'd laugh at Daniel's stories, the kind of laughter that belonged to someone who had learned to perform it in the right places. When they announced their engagement, Daniel called me, his voice warm but rushed, as though I were just one stop on a list of people to tell. I congratulated him, pictured my wife's face if she had been there, and told him to bring Celine by so we could celebrate. She didn't come. Instead, Daniel arrived alone with a polite excuse, something about Celine's work schedule. We sat at the corner table with 2 glasses of wine, and he told me about their plans: a modern wedding venue, a honeymoon in Bali, a new apartment with glass walls and city views. He spoke about it all with an excitement I hadn't heard since he was a boy, but there was no mention of the cafe. Not once. I didn't push. A father learns, over time, which questions close doors instead of opening them. I told myself it was simply a busy season in his life, that once things settled, he'd come back, they both would. The wedding was beautiful, in the way magazine spreads are beautiful. Everything was pale and symmetrical, from the flowers to the place settings. I sat at a table near the back, watching my son move through the crowd with a confidence that seemed to belong more to her than to him. When they danced, she leaned her head just enough to rest against his shoulder without musing her hair. Afterward, when I hugged her, she smelled faintly of expensive perfume and something else: distance. In the years that followed, our meetings became fewer. Sometimes Daniel came alone, sometimes we met in restaurants where the menus felt like they were written in another language entirely. Celine always dressed for photographs, her phone never far from reach. She would smile politely when I asked about her work but would drift into conversation with others when the topic turned to the cafe. I began to notice small things: her reluctance to accept any dish I cooked, the way she sometimes spoke for Daniel when I asked him a question, the faint but unmistakable way she seemed to look through the cafe rather than at it. Still, I didn't think much of it. Families are made of different kinds of people, I told myself. Not everyone needs to love the same things. It was enough that Daniel knew where he came from, enough that the cafe, and everything in it, would one day be his. I clung to that belief like it was a life raft. I held on to the image of him, years from now, standing behind the counter with flour on his hands, greeting customers the way his mother once did. What I didn't see then, what I refused to see, was that the life raft was already leaking. That while I was tending to memories, someone else was quietly charting a different course. One day, I found a photo of Daniel and Celine in a glossy magazine spread about young power couples. The caption mentioned her career, his work in finance, their stylish city apartment. There was no mention of the cafe. No mention of the small corner of the world where he learned the value of warmth and honest work. That night, I locked up the cafe and stood in the middle of the empty room. The chairs were stacked on the tables, the floor swept clean, the smell of the day's bread still faint in the air. I thought of my wife, her hands shaping dough, her voice humming softly under her breath. I thought of the little boy who once fell asleep in the booth by the kitchen door. I didn't know it yet, but I was already standing at the edge of the warm years, looking out toward something colder. It started so quietly I almost convinced myself it was nothing. A forgotten invitation here, a delayed phone call there. The kind of things you tell yourself are just the pace of modern life. One spring, I called Daniel to tell him the lilacs by the cafe window were blooming, his mother's lilacs, planted the year he was born. He said he'd try to stop by, but weeks passed, and the flowers browned and fell without him seeing them. Celine's absence became a given. At first she'd send polite excuses, work deadlines, social commitments, just too much going on right now. But soon there weren't even words, just the quiet assumption she wouldn't be there. When Daniel did come alone, he never stayed long. There was always a meeting, a dinner, a reason to leave before the coffee cooled. That summer, the first real blow landed. I had prepared a family lunch, roasted chicken with rosemary, the same dish I'd made every year on Daniel's birthday since he was a boy. They arrived late, Celine dressed like she'd stepped out of a boutique catalog. She glanced at the table, at the chicken glistening in its dish, and smiled without warmth. "Oh. I don't eat that anymore," she said, sliding into her seat. "Too greasy." Daniel didn't say anything. The words hung there, awkward and sharp, until I served the others and took my own plate without comment. I told myself it didn't matter, but that night, alone in the cafe, I found myself washing the roasting pan twice, as if I could scrub away the sting. By autumn, invitations to their home became rarer. When they did come, the atmosphere had shifted. Celine spoke about real business and serious investments, the kind of language that made my little cafe sound like a hobby for a man who hadn't kept up with the times. She never asked about the day's menu, never about the regulars who still came like clockwork. One evening, at a small family gathering, I brought a basket of fresh bread, crust golden, still warm from the oven. It was the bread my wife had perfected over decades, the bread that once drew people in off the street just by smell alone. Celine thanked me, set it on the sideboard, and left it untouched all night. Later, I saw her hand a bag of it to a neighbor as they left, smiling like she was offering something quaint and old-fashioned, a curiosity rather than a gift. I tried not to dwell on it, but the silences between us grew heavier. Where once there had been the easy warmth of shared meals and simple conversation, now there were polite exchanges, pauses too long to be comfortable, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The real turning point came at a dinner Daniel invited me to, just the three of us. I imagined a quiet meal, a chance to reconnect. Instead, I found myself seated at a long, modern table in their apartment, the city skyline stretching behind them like a wall of light. "We've been thinking," Daniel began, glancing at Celine before continuing. "About, what's next for you?" "What's next?" I asked, though I already felt the chill in the air. Celine leaned forward, her voice smooth. "You've worked hard all your life. Maybe it's time to slow down. Let younger people take the reins." Her tone was light, but the message was heavy. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an assessment. Daniel nodded, his eyes flicking to me and away again. "It might be more comfortable for you, Dad. You wouldn't have to worry about the cafe anymore." I sipped my wine, letting the silence stretch. They didn't notice how tightly I gripped the stem of the glass. I told myself, as I walked home that night, that this was just care disguised as practicality. That they were thinking of me, not just of themselves. But deep down, something shifted. The warmth I had once taken for granted now felt like a fire seen from a distance, still visible, but no longer within reach. The cracks had formed, thin and almost invisible at first, but each one ran deeper than I wanted to admit. And like the hairline fractures in old porcelain, they were only waiting for the right pressure to split wide open. It was late winter when Daniel came to the cafe unannounced. The cold clung to him as he stepped inside, shaking off his coat. He hadn't come alone. Celine followed, her boots clicking on the worn wooden floor, her eyes scanning the room with that same restless precision she'd had from the first day I met her. I had just finished serving the last lunch customers, the smell of roasted garlic and thyme still hanging in the air. The light was low, the kind of light that makes the brass fixtures glow softly, and for a moment I thought perhaps they'd come simply to share a meal. Instead, Daniel asked if we could sit in the back. His voice was careful, too careful. We took the corner booth near the kitchen door, the one where he used to do his homework while his mother and I worked. I could still picture him there, knees swinging under the table, crumbs on his notebook. Now, he was sitting upright, hands folded, his eyes darting to Celine before he spoke. "Dad," he began, "we've been talking about your living situation." Celine leaned in, her perfume crisp and expensive. "You've been alone in that apartment for years now. It's not healthy." "I'm fine," I said, my voice even. "You are," Daniel said quickly, "but we think it would be better if you stayed with us. It's more practical. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or upkeep." I set my hands on the table, palms flat. "And the cafe?" Daniel's smile was almost rehearsed. "We could manage it for you. Keep it running. You can still come in, of course, but you won't have to handle the day-to-day. It'll give you time to rest." There was a warmth to his tone that might have fooled someone else. But I'd run a kitchen long enough to know when sweetness was masking something sharper. Celine added, "We've already talked to a contractor about some updates. Modernizing. Expanding the wine selection, adjusting the menu. It's a good opportunity." I looked at her. "It's done fine as it is." She tilted her head, her smile fixed. "Yes, but fine isn't enough these days. You know how competitive things are now." In that moment, I understood, this wasn't just about me moving in with them. It was about the cafe, about control. The irony was, they didn't know the deed was still in my name. Years earlier, when my wife and I had discussed leaving the cafe to Daniel, I had insisted on keeping the paperwork secure until the time was right. It wasn't mistrust back then, just a habit of carefulness. Now, I was quietly grateful for it. Still, I didn't argue. A kitchen teaches you that sometimes silence is the best seasoning. Let things simmer until the flavors reveal themselves. I nodded slowly. "If you think it's best." Daniel's shoulders relaxed. Celine's eyes glimmered, just slightly. Over the next few weeks, the arrangement was set. They came by to help with paperwork, to streamline processes. Celine walked through the cafe with a notebook, jotting down changes she'd make, removing the mismatched vases, painting over the old photographs on the walls. I didn't stop her notes. Paper can hold anything, reality is another matter. When the moving day came, Daniel hired a truck for my belongings. Celine insisted on paring down what I brought. "We'll make sure you only take what you need," she said, sorting my books into piles without asking. I kept the deed in my breast pocket the whole day. She never saw it. Their home was large and modern, all glass and steel. My room was neatly prepared, though it felt more like a guest space than a place for a man to live out his days. The first night, Daniel poured me a glass of wine, and Celine made a toast, to family, and new beginnings. I smiled and drank, but inside, I thought of the cafe, the slow mornings, the smell of bread, the sound of the bell over the door. I thought of my wife's hands in mine, the way she had looked at that place as if it were another member of the family. I told myself this move was temporary. That I could watch, and wait, and see what they truly intended. It didn't take long for the signs to appear. The first mornings in their home felt still. Too still. I was used to the cafe's rhythm, the quiet clatter of pans, the hiss of the coffee machine warming, the slow bloom of bread scenting the air. Here, the day began with the faint hum of a refrigerator and the muted shuffle of someone's slippers on polished floors. Daniel left early, suit pressed, tie knotted perfectly. "See you tonight, Dad," he'd say, kissing Celine's cheek on his way out. She would nod to me over her coffee mug, already scanning something on her tablet. For the first couple of weeks, there was a kind of surface warmth. We ate breakfast together sometimes, yogurt, fruit, small talk. Daniel told me about clients and quarterly reports, Celine mentioned social events and meetings. They asked, now and then, about how I was settling in. I answered politely, never too much. I visited the cafe often at first, telling myself I was just stopping by to check the ovens, to greet the staff. But each time, there was a subtle shift. The tables were arranged differently. The vases, my wife's vases, had been replaced with sleek, identical glass cylinders. The chalkboard menu was gone, replaced by a printed one with glossy photographs. Celine was always too busy to visit, but I knew her fingerprints were on every change. One afternoon, I walked in to find the wine list rewritten. They'd removed the modest local bottles we'd carried for decades and replaced them with overpriced imports that looked good on paper but lacked soul. I mentioned it to Daniel later. He smiled and said, "It's all about image now, Dad. People like to feel they're getting something exclusive." I said nothing, but I thought of the old postman who came every Friday for his usual glass of Bourgogne, the one we'd poured him for 15 years. Exclusive wasn't what kept people coming back. The first real jolt came when I found my recipe notebook in the trash. It was early evening, I had stopped by the cafe unannounced. The staff were in the back, finishing prep, and I saw the black leather-bound book, worn soft at the edges, peeking out of a bin. The sight stopped me cold. That notebook held my wife's handwriting alongside mine, the original measurements for her rosemary bread, the first notes on the onion soup she perfected in our first year. I picked it up, brushed off a dusting of flour, and slid it into my coat pocket. No one saw me do it. That night, at dinner, I asked Daniel if he'd seen the notebook lately. He frowned. "Oh, I think Celine wanted to digitize the recipes. She probably figured the old one was outdated." Outdated. My wife's script. The ink smudged from years of flour-dusted fingers. I didn't argue. But as I lay in bed that night, I knew this new arrangement wasn't about making things easier for me, it was about erasing what had come before. For a while, I played along. I joined them for dinners, listened to their plans for modernizing the business, even smiled when Celine described hosting wine tastings for her friends in the space, once it had the right look. But in quiet moments, I began to notice the small withdrawals. "The lock on the wine cabinet at home, just for guests," she said. My mail arriving already opened. My clothes reorganized, in drawers I hadn't touched. The house itself felt less like a home and more like a polished showroom where I'd been placed for display. My room was clean, comfortable, but sparse, no photographs, no trace of my life except for the suit hanging in the closet and the cane leaning against the wall. I still went to the cafe, but each time, I stayed less and less. It was becoming something unrecognizable, dressed in a skin that looked like success but felt hollow. One evening, Celine mentioned over dinner that she'd been speaking with a designer about a rebrand. "It's time we let go of the old image," she said, twirling her fork. "A fresh start. People love a fresh start." I watched her, the way she leaned back in her chair, confident, certain. I knew she wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking over me, to Daniel, to herself, to the vision she'd already decided would replace mine. I smiled faintly, kept my eyes on my plate, and thought, let them think the old man is fading into the background. Let them think I'm done. The surface harmony held, but beneath it, I could hear the slow, steady creak of the floorboards before the weight of something heavy finally breaks them. It happened on a Saturday night, the kind of evening where the air hums with conversation and wine glasses catch the light just so. Daniel had invited me to join them for dinner at one of Celine's favorite restaurants, a sleek, modern place with plates that looked more like paintings than meals. From the moment we walked in, I could tell this was her stage. The host greeted her by name, the maitre d' came to shake her hand, and we were led to a corner table where 3 of her friends were already seated, all dressed like they were about to be photographed. "Everyone," Celine said brightly, "this is Daniel's father. He used to run a little cafe." "A little cafe." I smiled politely, shook hands, sat down. The table was already laid with expensive wine, menus that read like manifestos, and a low arrangement of orchids in the center. The talk was fast, full of names I didn't know, places I'd never been. When the food came, Celine's friend, a tall man with a narrow face, asked if I missed working. I told him I still visited the cafe from time to time. Before I could say more, Celine laughed lightly, interrupting. "Oh, he's retired now. Practically our dependent, aren't you?" The laughter that followed was brittle, but it spread quickly around the table. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. She leaned toward her friend and added, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "We keep him well fed. Like keeping a pet happy." It was meant as a joke, the kind people think they can get away with because they dress it in a smile. But the word hung in the air like smoke, dependent. I felt the warmth drain from my face. I put my fork down slowly, resting it against the plate. Daniel didn't look at me, his eyes stayed fixed on his wine glass. Someone changed the subject, but I barely heard it. My hand rested on the linen napkin in my lap, the fabric soft and thick between my fingers. I began folding it, first in half, then again, until it was a neat square. It was a trick my wife had taught me when anger threatened to rise: give your hands a task, let the sharp edge of your feelings dull before you speak. So I folded, and I breathed, and I told myself not to react here, not in front of her friends. When the plates were cleared, Celine ordered dessert for the table without asking. Something elaborate and delicate arrived, all spun sugar and edible gold leaf. She made a point of telling her friends, "This is why I love places like this, not like those old-fashioned places that think bread and soup are enough to impress anyone." The jab was deliberate, and for a moment I considered saying something. But instead, I lifted my coffee cup, sipped slowly, and let my eyes meet hers. I held her gaze just long enough for her smile to flicker. The conversation moved on, but inside me, something shifted. I'd spent months telling myself her little slights were thoughtless, unmeant. But tonight, I saw them for what they were, deliberate strokes in a painting she'd been working on since the day we met. When dinner ended, Daniel offered to drive me home, but Celine insisted they had somewhere to be afterward. I took a cab instead, the city lights sliding past the window in long, blurred streaks. At home, I hung my coat, set the folded napkin on my desk, and stared at it. A small thing, really, just cloth, creased neatly into a square. But it felt like a knot, a tether, holding back the tide of something I'd kept buried for too long. I knew then that this wasn't just a matter of adapting to change. This was a quiet campaign to erase me, to turn me into a footnote in my own life's work. And campaigns, I thought, can be met with resistance. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who laughed at you while you stayed quiet? After that dinner, the air between us didn't shift all at once, it thinned, like a thread fraying slowly instead of snapping clean. Celine grew bolder in her small humiliations. She never repeated the dependent remark exactly, but she found new ways to press that same bruise. The wine cabinet at home was locked one day when I went to pour myself a glass after dinner. "Oh, that's for guests," she said lightly, slipping the key into her pocket. I was a guest, apparently, though the word felt more like intruder. Daniel seemed less and less himself in my presence. When I tried to ask about the cafe, his answers were brief, evasive. "It's fine, Dad, we've got it covered," he'd say, changing the subject before I could ask about menu changes or staff. Once, I returned to the cafe unannounced. The front door was open, but the air inside felt wrong, too cold, too quiet, the smell of slow-roasted onions replaced by something artificial, a faint chemical tang from a scent diffuser on the counter. The mismatched chairs my wife had chosen were gone, replaced with sterile uniformity. A stranger in a crisp white shirt asked if I had a reservation. I walked the space slowly, touching the new chairs, the slick tablet menus. The walls were bare, the old photographs of my wife kneading dough, of Daniel as a boy handing a coffee to a smiling customer, all gone. I didn't ask where they were. I knew. Back at the house, my mail began arriving already opened. "We just wanted to make sure nothing urgent slipped through," Celine explained with a smile that was pure theater. My clothes were reorganized into a different drawer arrangement without my permission. "More efficient," she said, like I'd been waiting my whole life for her to rescue me from the burden of knowing where my own socks were. The distance between Daniel and me widened further with every dinner we shared. His laughter was easy with her, but with me it was replaced by the careful tone of someone avoiding a subject. When I did catch his eye, it flickered away too quickly, as if looking too long might pull him back to a place he didn't want to revisit. One rainy afternoon, I overheard Celine speaking on the phone in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, the words just carried through the half-open door. "He doesn't have much time left in him," she was saying, her voice low but laced with satisfaction. "When he's gone, it's all ours." A pause, then a short, sharp laugh. "Old men cling to buildings like ghosts. But they can't haunt them forever." The words hit me like a pot dropped on stone, a sharp, metallic shock. I stepped back before she could see me. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady, deliberate, like a drumbeat before a march. I made tea in silence, my hands working from habit, the sound of her laughter still echoing in my ears. That night, I didn't bring it up. I watched them eat, the two of them talking about their week, and I felt as though I were looking at them from the far side of a glass wall. The next day, I walked to the cafe before dawn. The streets were quiet, rain still clinging to the cobblestones. I stood outside, staring at the neon sign my wife and I had hung with our own hands, the last piece of the place that hadn't been replaced. The glow was softer now, almost tired. I wondered how long it would stay before they decided it, too, was outdated. I thought of the years I'd poured into that place, the life I'd built with my wife, the boy who had grown up between its walls. I thought of how easily it could be stripped away, repainted, renamed, as if it had never been ours at all. The cuts were small, yes, but they were adding up. And small cuts, left unattended, can bleed a man dry. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard them come in. I'd been lying in bed, the lamp off, listening to the distant hum of the city through the window. Their voices carried up the hall, low at first, then sharper. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when a truth wants to find you, it doesn't knock politely. "You can't just rush it," Daniel was saying, his voice taut. Celine's reply was smooth, cutting. "We've been patient long enough. The place is practically ours already. We just need to finalize things." I lay still, breathing slow. Daniel's tone softened, almost hesitant. "He's still, well, he's still my father." A pause. The sound of heels clicking against tile. Then her voice again, dripping with contempt. "And? He'll die eventually, then the cafe is ours outright. Why wait?" Silence. Then a low laugh from her, like the scrape of a knife against porcelain. "Old men cling to buildings like ghosts. But ghosts don't have keys." The words didn't hit me all at once. They landed in pieces, sharp edges finding their place inside me. I stayed in bed long after they went quiet, staring into the dark. My mind wasn't racing, it was deliberate, methodical, moving through memories like files in a cabinet. Every smile that hadn't reached the eyes. Every small suggestion about the cafe's future. Every time Daniel had looked away instead of speaking. By dawn, I was at the cafe. The streets were empty, the sky the pale gray of an unbaked loaf. I let myself in with my key, and stood just inside the door. The smell was wrong now, but faint traces of the old life lingered if you knew where to find them. The faint aroma of coffee grounds clinging to the air ducts. A scratch on the corner table where Daniel had once carved his initials when he thought no one was looking. I walked the perimeter slowly, my hand brushing the walls, the countertops, the shelves. Everything I touched had a memory attached. Everything was mine in a way that had nothing to do with paper or signatures. The thought came to me as clear as a bell, they had mistaken my silence for surrender. When I left that morning, I locked the door carefully, slipping the key back into my coat pocket as though it were a relic. Back at the house, breakfast was laid out, fruit, yogurt, pastries in a neat box from a place Celine liked. She smiled at me, that polished, hollow smile, and asked if I'd slept well. Like a ghost, I said. She laughed as if it were nothing. But I knew now. The betrayal wasn't something I'd imagined, some phantom born of loneliness or suspicion. It was real, living in the walls around me, spoken aloud without shame. And once you know a thing like that, you can't unknow it. If your own child's partner said you were just waiting to die, what would you feel first, grief or rage? The morning after I overheard them, the house felt colder than usual. Not the kind of cold you chase away with a thicker sweater, this was the kind that settled in your bones, a quiet frost that made every sound feel sharper. Daniel left early for work. He kissed Celine on the cheek, mumbled a goodbye in my direction, and was gone. She stayed in the kitchen, tapping away on her tablet. I poured myself coffee in silence, the steam curling up between us like a fragile barrier. She didn't look up. I didn't speak. I carried the mug to my room, set it on the small desk by the window, and sat there for a long time. Outside, a leaf skittered along the pavement, caught in a wind that seemed to know exactly where it was going. I envied it. The thing about betrayal, real betrayal, is that it doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. That night, I hadn't been struck down by anger or disbelief. I had been hollowed out, piece by piece, until there was more space inside me than there should have been. I picked up one of the few photographs I'd brought to their home, my wife, standing in the cafe doorway, hair tied back, a dusting of flour on her cheek. She was smiling, that unguarded, easy smile that came only when she was completely herself. I set the picture down and traced the edge of the frame with my finger. They wanted to take it all. Not just the cafe, but the history inside it, the years of laughter and arguments and burnt loaves and perfect loaves. They wanted the shell without the soul, like buying a violin and never caring if it played. By mid-afternoon, I found myself walking without thinking, my steps carrying me down familiar streets until I was standing in front of the cafe again. The sign, still the same one we'd hung with our own hands, glowed faintly in the pale winter light. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The quiet wrapped around me like an old coat. I moved slowly, touching the worn edge of the counter, the cool glass of the display case. In the kitchen, I ran my hand over the work table where my wife had kneaded dough thousands of times. The grooves in the wood still fit my palms perfectly. I stayed there for hours, not cooking, not cleaning, just existing in the space, letting the weight of it sink into me again. When the light began to fade, I locked up and walked home. Celine was setting the table when I came in. She glanced at me, then at the clock, but didn't ask where I'd been. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows in the room seemed longer than usual, reaching out like fingers. Somewhere in the dark, I made a quiet decision, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who's already lost the most important thing and knows he can't lose it twice. I would not confront them yet. I would not storm or accuse. But I would not let them take what was mine. Not the cafe. Not my history. Not the last piece of my wife I still had left. Some mornings, resolve announces itself with fire, a sudden surge of adrenaline that sends you rushing into action. Mine came in silence. It was a Wednesday, the kind of gray, wet day when the streets seem to exhale steam and the sky can't decide whether to rain or not. Daniel had left for work, Celine had retreated to her office, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling beside me. I took the deed out of my coat pocket. I'd kept it there for weeks now, folded neatly inside a plain envelope, the paper worn soft at the creases. My wife and I had signed it together, years ago, laughing about how official it felt to own something we'd built with our own hands. I turned it over in my fingers. The cafe's name was still written in the same ink, the same careful hand. My name was still there, and mine alone. They didn't know. I slid it back into my pocket, buttoning the flap of my coat like I was securing something alive inside it. That afternoon, I called an old friend, Henri, a lawyer I'd known since the early days of the cafe. He used to come in every Saturday with his wife, order the onion soup and a bottle of wine, and stay for hours. I hadn't spoken to him much since my wife passed, but his voice on the phone was the same, steady, unhurried. We met in his office the next morning. The place smelled faintly of paper and leather, a scent I'd always associated with trust. I told him what I'd overheard, what I suspected, and what I feared was coming. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You still have full legal ownership?" I nodded. "Then they can't take it without your consent. But if you're asking whether they can try to maneuver you into signing something," he spread his hands. "People have been known to do worse to family." I asked him to make sure nothing could change without my direct approval, to put safeguards in place quietly. He agreed, his eyes holding mine in a way that said he understood this was about more than property. Afterward, I didn't go straight home. I walked to the cafe, slipped inside, and sat at a corner table. The staff greeted me warmly, a few of the old ones still used chef when they spoke to me. That word, simple as it was, reminded me that I still had a place here, even if they were trying to write me out of the story. I began spending more afternoons there. Not every day, I didn't want to be obvious, but enough to remind the staff who I was, and enough to feel the pulse of the place. I'd taste a sauce, adjust the seasoning, offer a quiet suggestion. They welcomed it. One afternoon, I met Luc, a young chef who'd just started. He was quick with his hands, curious, and respectful in a way that was rare now. We spoke about recipes, about my wife's bread, and I promised to show him the original method one day. At home, I played the part they expected. I listened when Celine talked about future plans for the cafe, nodding like an old man too tired to argue. I let Daniel believe I was stepping back, letting them handle things. But every time I reached into my coat pocket and felt the deed there, I was reminded, I hadn't stepped back. I was simply walking a quieter path, one they hadn't noticed yet. In the evenings, I started going through my wife's recipe notebook, the one I'd rescued from the trash. The pages were worn, the ink smudged in places, but each note was a thread tying me back to her. I began rewriting the recipes in a clean ledger, not to replace the old book, but to prepare something I could hand to the right person when the time came. Resolve, I found, isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about planting seeds in the dark, knowing they'll grow when the light finally reaches them. The first step was simple, I changed the locks. Not at home, at the cafe. It was early on a Tuesday, before the city was fully awake, and I arrived with a set of fresh brass keys in my pocket. Luc let me in, and together we swapped the locks without a word to anyone else. The staff would get their own keys, of course. But Daniel and Celine? They wouldn't notice until the day they tried to walk in without me. From there, I began reclaiming small corners of the place. It started with the bread, my wife's bread, the one they'd removed from the menu because it didn't photograph well. I brought in flour from the same mill we'd used for years, kneaded it by hand in the quiet before service, and had Luke bake it to perfection. When it came out of the oven, the smell filled the kitchen, and even the new staff, the ones who'd never met my wife, stopped to breathe it in. We didn't put it on the official menu. We offered it to regulars, to people who remembered the old days. They told others, and soon it became the thing people came in asking for by name. Next, I called a local food critic, an old acquaintance who had written kindly about the cafe when it first opened. I invited him to lunch, cooked for him myself, and told him I was just helping out while the owners were away. He smiled at that but didn't press. A week later, his review appeared online, praising the quiet return of the soul to the cafe. Celine didn't notice. She never read local reviews, too small scale for her taste. I also began speaking quietly with suppliers. Some of them had known me for decades, they were glad to see me involved again. I asked them to bring certain ingredients directly to me and to keep it between us. They agreed without hesitation. With each small change, I felt the place leaning back toward its roots. It wasn't a full reclamation yet, that would come later, but it was enough to plant doubt in the minds of anyone who thought the cafe had left its past behind entirely. At home, I kept up my performance. I nodded when Celine talked about a grand reopening after renovations, smiled when she described new uniforms and wine tastings for her friends. I gave nothing away. One evening, over dinner, she said, "You've really been relaxing these days. It's nice to see you letting go of old responsibilities." I sipped my wine. "Sometimes you have to step back and let things grow," I said. She took it as a compliment. She didn't realize I wasn't talking about her plans. The staff grew more comfortable coming to me for guidance. Luke in particular started treating me less like a retired owner and more like a mentor. One afternoon, as we shaped dough together, he said, "Chef, I hope you never stop coming in. The place feels different when you're here." I didn't answer, just patted the loaf into its final shape and slid it into the oven. But inside, something settled more firmly into place, a certainty that this wasn't just about saving the cafe for myself. It was about protecting it for the right hands, when the time came to pass it on. For now, I was content to let Celine believe she was in control, to let Daniel think I had stepped aside. I knew their type, they would only look for threats in the places they expected them. And I was no longer on their list. But every day I walked into that kitchen, every loaf of bread that came out golden, every regular who smiled like they'd come home again, those were my quiet victories. What would your first quiet act of revenge be if no one thought you still had power? By late spring, the pieces were nearly in place. The cafe was running more on my rhythm than theirs now, though they didn't realize it. The bread was back in quiet rotation, the suppliers were loyal to me, and Luke had learned half the recipes from my wife's old notebook. Even the regulars who had drifted away were beginning to return, drawn by whispers that the old magic was back. All that remained was to formalize my control, not just in spirit, but on paper, in a way that couldn't be touched. Henri had prepared the necessary documents, securing the cafe as mine entirely and shielding it from any transfer without my explicit consent. The final signatures would be done the following week. But Celine's instincts, as sharp as a blade, began to twitch. One afternoon, she appeared at the cafe unannounced, her heels clicking across the tile like a gavel. She had a designer in tow, a man in a tailored suit carrying fabric swatches and glossy boards. "I thought we'd get some photos before the renovation," she said, standing in the doorway as if she owned the place. I wiped my hands on a towel and smiled mildly. "Renovation?" She launched into a speech about brand alignment and visual identity, pointing to walls she wanted to knock down, colors she wanted to replace. Her designer nodded dutifully, jotting notes. I didn't argue, not outright. Instead, I offered her tea. We sat at the corner table while the designer wandered about with his camera. I asked her about her week, about Daniel, about anything but the cafe. All the while, I made sure to keep her here, drinking tea and talking, until the staff had closed the kitchen for the afternoon. When she finally left, she didn't have a single usable photograph. That night, I called Henri and asked him to move our signing date up. He agreed, sensing the urgency. The next day, another complication arrived, a health inspector. He was polite but thorough, citing a tip he'd received about questionable practices in the kitchen. Nothing came of it, we passed without issue, but I could see in his expression that he knew this was no routine visit. Someone had tried to make trouble. I didn't need to guess who. That evening, Daniel confronted me at home. "Dad, why are you making it so hard for us to move forward with the cafe? Celine says you've been resisting the changes we've planned." I looked at him for a long moment before reaching into my coat pocket. Slowly, I placed an envelope on the table between us. He glanced down but didn't touch it. "What's this?" "Proof," I said. "That the cafe is mine. That it will stay mine until I decide otherwise." He stared at me, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, not anger, exactly, but not pride either. More like a man realizing he'd been standing in the wrong shadow. He didn't open the envelope. He just nodded once and left the room. The obstacle wasn't the documents, or the designer, or even the health inspector. It was the fact that my son had let things get this far without standing beside me. That wound would take longer to address than any legal matter. The night of the dinner was Celine's idea. She called it a soft relaunch of the cafe, a way to showcase the upcoming renovations to a handful of her friends, business contacts, and a few influential food bloggers she'd been cultivating. The invitations were sent without consulting me, but I didn't object. In fact, I encouraged her, telling her I'd be glad to attend. What she didn't know was that, 3 days earlier, I had signed Henry's papers. On paper, in law, and in reality, the cafe was now shielded entirely, mine to the last tile. And it bore a new name, Benoit's Table. The sign was being changed the morning of her dinner. When I arrived that evening, the room was already full, every table occupied, the air warm with conversation and the scent of bread I had baked that afternoon. Not the sterile scent diffuser she preferred, real bread, split open, steaming. Celine was dressed to be photographed, her smile wide and practiced as she moved from table to table. Daniel trailed behind her, shaking hands, laughing politely. I stayed in the kitchen, letting the guests eat, letting the hum of the room build until it was steady and rich. Then, when the desserts began to leave the pass, I stepped out. The chatter softened as people noticed me, not with confusion, but with recognition. Many of them were regulars who hadn't seen me in years. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying just enough to quiet the room, "thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you're enjoying your meal at Benoit's Table." The name landed like a dropped glass. Celine froze mid-step, her head snapping toward the front window where the new sign hung in gold letters. She blinked, once, twice, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing. Someone asked, "When did the name change?" "This week," I said calmly. "The cafe has come home, in every sense. It's mine, as it always was. And tonight, you've tasted a few things from my wife's original recipes, the same ones that built this place from the ground up." A murmur spread through the room. Some guests smiled, others glanced at Celine, who was now standing utterly still, her smile gone. She stepped forward, her voice low but tight. "We didn't discuss this." I met her eyes. "No. We didn't." Daniel stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He looked at me, then at her, and said nothing. I let the silence fill the room, not rushing to explain, not softening the edges. Silence, I'd learned, can be sharper than any word. Celine tried to recover, turning to her guests with a laugh that didn't quite land. "Well, I suppose surprises keep life interesting. But her tone was brittle, and the sparkle in her eyes was gone. The evening continued, but the energy had shifted. Conversations turned toward the bread, the onion soup, the cocoa vin, the dishes that had made the café beloved long before she entered the picture. Guests sought me out, asking for stories, for the history behind each plate. By the end of the night, it was clear, whatever she had planned for the café's future had evaporated in the glow of what it truly was, and who it truly belonged to. I walked her and Daniel to the door as the last guests left. She didn't meet my eyes. He did, briefly, but said nothing. It was enough. If the person who mocked you in public had to watch you succeed in front of everyone, would you say anything, or let silence speak for you? The days after the dinner passed more quietly than I expected. Celine didn't set foot in the café. Not once. Word must have traveled through her circle, about the sign, the papers, the way the guests had gravitated toward me instead of her. She didn't mention it at home either, but the absence of her voice on the subject was louder than any argument she could have started. Daniel came by alone 3 days later. He arrived in the afternoon, when the café was between the lunch and dinner rush. The light through the front windows was soft, catching on the flour dust in the air. I was shaping loaves with Luke when the doorbell rang. "Hi, Dad," he said, stepping inside. He looked tired. Not worn down, exactly, just lighter, in a way that suggested he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. I wiped my hands on my apron. "Coffee?" He nodded, and we sat at the corner table, the one near the kitchen door where he used to do his homework. For a while, we didn't speak. I let him sit with the smell of baking bread, with the sound of Luke moving around the kitchen. The café had a way of coaxing truth out of people, it always had. "Finally," he said, "I didn't realize how much this place meant." "Not really." "Not until the other night." I didn't answer. He glanced at the shelves where I'd restored the old photographs, my wife laughing in the kitchen, him as a boy holding a tray of cookies, the three of us standing in front of the café on the day it opened. I let myself forget all that. I thought we were moving forward, making something better. But, his voice trailed off. "But?" I prompted. "But we were just making it different. Not better." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry, Dad. For not seeing it sooner." There was sincerity in his voice, and maybe a little shame. But I didn't rush to forgive him. Some truths take time to absorb. "You still have a life outside this place," I said. "The café will be here. It always will. But you have to decide what's worth holding on to." He nodded slowly, as if he understood that I wasn't just talking about the business. When he left, he shook my hand instead of hugging me. It was a small gesture, but I could feel the shift, the first step toward something more honest between us, even if it would never be quite the same as before. That evening, I walked through the café alone after closing. The chairs were stacked, the floor swept, the air still warm from the ovens. I looked at the photographs, the mismatched vases, the bread cooling on the racks, and I felt still. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just steady. Celine had been erased from the café without a word. No confrontation, no public shaming, just absence, the quiet kind that lets a place breathe again. I knew she wouldn't try to come back. People like her don't fight for something they can't control. And me? I had no need to flaunt the victory. The café was mine, as it always had been. That was enough. The summer light lingers longer now, spilling through the café windows well past closing. In the evenings, I water the basil plant on the sill, the same one grown from cuttings my wife once tended in our kitchen at home. Its leaves are deep green, fragrant, resilient. The café hums with life again. The regulars have returned, bringing new faces with them. Luke moves through the kitchen with confidence, knowing the rhythms now by heart. Sometimes I catch him humming under his breath the way my wife used to when she worked the dough. Daniel comes by now and then, never with Celine. He stays longer than before, sitting at the corner table, asking about the bread, about the customers, about the past. We talk more, but carefully, not forcing closeness, just letting it grow in its own time. The photographs on the wall have their stories back. Customers pause to look at them, asking questions, smiling at the snapshots of another time. The bread baskets are always empty by the end of the day. The old brass bell over the door still sings when someone steps inside. I keep the deed in my office now, framed behind glass. Not out of pride, but as a quiet reminder, some things are worth holding in your own hands, no matter how gently someone else promises to carry them. On some nights, after the last table has gone and the chairs are stacked, I sit by the window with a cup of coffee. The street outside is quiet, the glow from the sign casting its soft light across the cobblestones. Benoit's table, EST in love, reclaimed in peace. I watch the steam rise from my cup, curl in the air, then disappear. And I think about how some victories aren't loud or sharp, they're simply the absence of loss. The cafe is mine. The memories are safe. And for the first time in a long while, so am I.